When you looked at the employment pages, there were jobs for women and jobs for men. And there's no question you wanted to be in the male category.
Hi, everybody. This is Alan Salisbury with the Coda Support Foundation, and welcome to episode 3 of Profiles in Service, the podcast that explores service to the nation in all its dimensions. Today, I'm privileged to have as my guest Elizabeth Becker, award-winning journalist, war correspondent, foreign correspondent, and author. At the risk of dating myself, I'm going to describe you, Elizabeth, as a distinguished member of the Fourth Estate, the noble profession of journalism. Welcome to the program, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'd like to start with your most recent endeavor, your newly published book, You Don't Belong Here: How the Three Women Rewrote the Story of War. You're garnering terrific reviews on this, I'm happy to say, and it contains a strong message reaching all the way back to the Vietnam War 50 plus years ago. When did you first decide you had to write these stories?
Like a lot of journalists, we're told all the time, you're writing the first draft of history. And but that's about something else. It took me a while to realize that I was part of that history as a foreign correspondent, as a war correspondent during the Vietnam War and the Cambodia campaign. And it took years to realize that. And as I did, I realized that the real story were the pioneer women who came at the beginning of the war and who really excelled not only at breaking the glass ceiling, but at really changing how the war is seen and being recognized for that as such. So that's many years. I didn't decide that I had to write it until about 2015.
These three women were your inspiration and role models who proved that women were fully capable of working in the, then at least, man's world of war amid the dangers and chaos of the battlefield. This put the lie to the long-held belief that they should only focus on the women's angle in their stories. That said, I kind of detect in your writing the notion that at least some women outdo many of the men in their ability to not only be present in the moment, but to be able to take a more comprehensive view, including the historical, societal, cultural forces, and even human impacts. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, there's no question that as outsiders, these women did all that you just said. I don't like to boil it down to woman versus man. That's too easy, and it misses a whole bunch of points. They did, and let me explain what outsider means. These women came without jobs. No one sent them. They paid their own way. They did not have experience as political reporters or anything resembling that. They had no resumes to speak of. They had to pay their own tickets. And when they got there, they had no editor telling them how to cover it. They had to offer to do freelance work and hope that it would be taken. So these are people without preconceptions, without training, which could have been a handicap. But because of who they were and how they went about it, they did things totally different than the men. And that's how you had this original, deeper and broader kind of reporting out of them. And they were three very different kinds of women and three very different kinds of reporters. And they come from three different continents, yet their outsider status very much allowed them the freedom to be extremely original. And I must say that we're talking about women arriving in 1966. And in those days, The war, the full American commitment to combat troops was only a year old. And in those days, women not only were put in what was then called the pink ghetto of only covering women's stories back in the United States. Women were raised very differently than men, which is not so much the case today. When you looked at the employment pages, there were jobs for women and jobs for men. And there's no question you wanted to be in the male category. Women could not have credit cards. Married women were Mrs. There was no Ms. There were no women athletics in public schools. I could go down the whole list. So they were actually, by their gender, raised differently. So it's not just the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. It was a much more genderized society. Yet when they got there, as I said, they did make all those changes.
You point out that they came from 3 different continents. They also came from very different social backgrounds. The one thing they had in common was they all spoke French. And I guess the other thing would be that they were all there to prove themselves, to themselves probably at least, as journalists. Did their different backgrounds give them different filters through which to view the war?
Well, sure, of course. I mean, totally. I mean, when you're French, you're French. When you're Australian, you're Australian. And you're American, you're American. And there are 3 different disciplines. One's a photojournalist. The French woman's a photojournalist. The Australian is a combat reporter, and the American is a long-form journalist. So, yes, and how what they chose to specialize in and how they went about it was very much reflected who they were.
You make it clear that the men didn't just passively resent the women, but they actively worked to undermine them and remove them from the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Your 3 pioneers were equal to that task of holding their own. What do you think was driving the men? Was it fear of competition, of not being able to compete with their game? The troops, on the other hand, were more accepting, were they not?
It was, again, let me start with Catherine Leroy, the French woman who was the photojournalist. That's the most male of all the things you can do in a war, is to be a photojournalist. She had to convince the head of photography for Associated Press that he should take a chance and let her at least try to freelance, which he did. He's one of the heroes in the books. And then she turned out to have an amazing eye and a lot of courage. And she was selling great photographs right away. Maybe good photographs is a better way. They became great. And so the male response was literally what my title was: you don't belong here. Women were decoration. Women were wives or whores. They were not professional journalists who you respected as a peer. And that's culture. It's not necessarily, yeah, certainly she was giving them competition, but there's a lot of culture in that. At that point, culturally, media in the United States did not send women to sports events because it was too violent. So they literally, women shouldn't go. So why did they turn against Catherine? I think it's a mixture of all of it. And then once, you know, the group starts doing it, it gets to be overwhelming. And some of the male reporters and worked with the press spokesman at the military headquarters in Saigon, and behind her back had her credentials taken away. And the reason was absolutely frivolous, you know, that she used foul language. Every photographer used foul language, that she didn't shower until she got back to Saigon. Everybody did that. I mean, she did nothing that they said disqualified her was something that the others didn't do. But because she was a woman, they took it away. She protested, appealed, and got her credentials back. But it really was significant for her, and she was very careful thereafter about who she worked with.
One of the things that is always brought up when you talk about women in combat is that They were afraid that the men will be distracted with a natural protective instinct for the women. I recall that Katrine in particular was very sensitive about, she had to carry all her heavy pack of photography gear and whatnot. She would not want the men to try to help her. Were there issues like that
Oh, sure.
in terms of acceptance?
Yeah, and that's serious because, again, that's cultural. Men are instinctively wanting to protect the woman in those days. I don't know how much that's true nowadays. There was an official military ban against women on the battlefield. The United States had the official ban. It dated back at least to World War II. And in theory, the women should not have been covering the American combat troop forces in Vietnam. But because President Johnson did not want to declare Vietnam a war, all rules about journalism were pretty much loosey-goosey. So women found a way to get to cover combat for the very first time in history. And when General Westmoreland, who was, of course, the head of all of US military in Vietnam, when he found out, he was furious. And exactly that fear came up. He said, I don't want the soldiers to think they have to do something special for you. And it took Katrine and a few other women had to negotiate to suspend the ban for a while. And in effect, that's when the ban ended. So they were very important for getting rid of that very final, you cannot do this. So that was very much part of the fear of the military.
Of course, all those bans and whatnot are falling by the wayside today. And I think, as you alluded to, we'll see probably there will be stories of heroism with women saving men on the battlefield before too long. So
I'm sure there already are.
Yep, there probably are. So once again, the book is You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War. And that's Elizabeth Becker's latest book, just out this year. Now, let's shift gears for a minute, Elizabeth, and talk more about you. You took your undergraduate degree work at the University of Washington and earned a degree in Indian or South Asian studies. And then you were next off to India, Agra, I think it was, and doing graduate studies there. How did you decide on this as your field of interest and study?
Well, I'm from Seattle, and Seattle looks to Asia. It's on the Pacific coast, obviously. But India particularly became an interest because of literature. When I was in high school, one of my teachers introduced us to the poetry and stories of Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali writer who was the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And so when I went to undergraduate, I realized that that's what I wanted to study. And so I convinced the university to allow me to make that degree, and they created a degree program.
Oh, you created the program.
I didn't. I applied for, and they created.
Yeah. Wonderful. What were you thinking career-wise early on? Was it like foreign service, teaching, journalism early in the picture, or what?
No, I wanted to go into academics and be a teacher.
Okay, that would have been a very different life.
Yeah, very different.
No doubt about that.
No.
So in 1972, you launched your career as a correspondent with the Washington Post. That is not exactly the starter job that all journalists get.
Well, you make it sound you make it sound more illustrious than it was. In graduate school, I had a contretemps with my major professor and realized I could not continue. So I took my fellowship money and bought a one-way ticket to Cambodia, where a friend of mine had become a very good freelance reporter and was trying to get me to join her out there. And, you're very naive. You don't understand things quite as well as you might want to at that age. And so I thought, oh, this won't be a big deal. I'll go out and I'll learn how to cover a war, maybe for a few months, and then I'll come back. Well, that was foolish. And I realized just how tough it was and what a commitment it would require, which I gave it. And this was the Cambodia campaign of the war. If you remember, the direct US combat taking over the war was 1965. And in 1970 was the invasion into Cambodia, which Congress put a kibosh to, and the troops had to come back after a few months. But the air war continued. So it developed into a more or less a civil war. So when I got there was very big interest in the war from the American media, and that's very important, because otherwise I don't know how I would do. But all the media needed articles, but most of the reporters were the correspondents for the outlets were living in Saigon or Hong Kong or someplace like that. There was nobody in Phnom Penh, the Cambodian capital. So they were looking for what's called a stringer. And that's the resident reporter who will do the reporting until the major correspondent would come in for the biggest story. And I landed at the right time. So after doing a few months with an Asian news magazine, I was hired by the Washington Post and Newsweek and NBC Radio to be the resident. So yes, I was very lucky.
Cambodia is a huge part of your professional career.
Yep.
And your accomplishments. And I'm going to give you another book plug here, because I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about comes from this, and I'll use the word tome, 600 plus pages of very fine print. When the war was over, Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge Revolution. You published that in 1986. Mm-hmm. And you had about 7 years of research into that then. I'll jump ahead and say that back in 1998, you revisited, come back with a new edition and probably an extra 10 years of research in it at that time. And things had changed sufficiently where you felt compelled to do that. Now we're 25 years past the second edition. Any thoughts about yet another update, because the story is still unfolding?
Oh, no. That would be an entirely different book, because this was about the war and the revolution. And my last book, The Update, ends with the peace accords and a new government. And it's a whole new era. So no, it wasn't. That was enough. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, well, back to sort of the original thread we were on here. Vietnam was then a communist country. In 1979, they invaded and occupied Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge regime was also a communist country. How would you describe the dynamics between these two regimes at that time?
Well, let's go back to the war itself. Because you can't understand the dynamics without doing a little refresher course on what happened. So the United States supported the South against communist Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam. Now, the 1954 Paris Peace Accords would have unified them under a national election, but the United States did not sign it, nor did Diem. And so that the conflict continued. First against France, and then when the nations were divided, Ho Chi Minh versus South Vietnam with active participation of the United States. So all through this, there was a tension among communists. The Sino-Soviet split was happening, and the Vietnamese did not want to take on Cambodia at all. And they had to deal with the neutral head of Cambodia, Norodom Sihanouk, that he would play, Nordum Sihanouk played one side against the other, with the Americans doing, and South Vietnamese helping one way and helping the communists another way. And this was great for the Vietnamese because they did not want to have to, help the very small Cambodian Communist Party. Well, that's the beginning of a strong resentment. The United States supported a military coup against Sihanouk, and then invasion, and then the North Vietnamese went to help the Khmer Rouge because they did not want the Americans to cut off their supply routes. I'm going into too much detail, but no, this is a long history. And so then both communist sides win. Now, remember, the raison d'etre for the United States in the war was stop the communists in Vietnam, because if they win, they'll take over all of Southeast Asia.
The domino theory.
Yes, and that goes back to President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles. And so this is the thing that just is so upended. Those theories, instead of communist Vietnam going after non-communist Southeast Asia, they had one war, and that was against communist Cambodia. And they overthrew the Khmer Rouge, who had been instigating a border war. And the Khmer Rouge were, besides genocidal, they were also incompetent. And like a lot of autocratic, awful dictators, you blame a neighbor for your problems. So Vietnam became their bad guy. And they instigated, they blamed a whole bunch of things on it. And finally, Vietnam said, I've had it. They overthrew the Khmer Rouge, and they thought, oh, the world is going to be happy with what we've done. Instead, the world was not, and sided with the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge were able to keep the UN seat. The Vietnamese were the ones who were criticized for taking over another country, and it sparked another war. The Vietnamese eventually left, and that triggered peace accords because everybody was afraid that then the Khmer Rouge would come back again, and then who would be blamed for it? So it's a very twist and turn, and none of it was predicted for all those terrible long years of war. None of it.
I got the impression from some of what I read that the population during the revolution, the Khmer Rouge Revolution, was somewhat indifferent to who might eventually survive and win the war, and that in that when the revolution finally concluded and the Khmer Rouge were in charge, they, having kept kind of a low profile, now emerged with a very different profile. And I guess the story that hit the US on the killing fields in terms of that movie tells the full range of the atrocities they convict. But am I right that...
the war was not the revolution. So the war is from 70s to 75, and that's just a war.
Okay.
There's no revolution. I mean, the North Vietnamese very much did most of the fighting in the first few years of the war, so that the Khmer Rouge could be. They were completely unprepared for this. They were not ready. They were not ready for prime time at all, and only when the North Vietnamese left, which was after the peace accords of 73, did the Khmer Rouge begin to take over. So they, the Cambodian population wanted the war over. They wanted, there's no question.
Exactly. That's your title. That's where their title really comes from.
And, but it's not as if they loved the Lon Nol regime. The government was corrupt. It was not democratic. It had some of the same issues of South Vietnam. Supposedly non-communist, but doesn't mean you're democratic. It was the opposite. And whenever there was a hint that the population wanted a different leader, Lon Nol declared martial law and jailed people, just like Diem and then Tu. And the other thing was that the neutral leader, Sihanouk, had gone to support the Khmer Rouge because he was furious that he was overthrown. So it was all a slosh, and people did not know which way was which. And even when the Khmer Rouge came to power, it took them a while to realize just how hideous they were. And then it was too late.
And you go on to point out that fully a quarter of the population of Cambodia was essentially slaughtered in the killing fields. As one of
they died through starvation, malnutrition, poor medicine. I mean, they were treated like work animals, and the whole country was cut off in a way that I don't think has any parallel in modern times, not even North Korea.
Has history really come to grips with the magnitude of that, almost a genocide?
Well, yes and no. We tend to be, like America, we tend to be very familiar with Europe. And we know the Holocaust story. We know how horrible that was, and there are Holocaust museums, and we know the Jewish Americans who had relatives, and with lots of movies and so on and so forth. We're less attuned to Asian countries, particularly, and Cambodia is a small Asian country, so it took a long time for this to break through. At first, the United States didn't want to believe it. A lot of countries didn't want to believe it. But you're right, the killing fields was very important for the popular message. And then after decades, finally there was a genocidal tribunal, which found the senior leaders guilty. So there's been progress.
We'll come back to that tribunal. I get a strong impression that your many years in Cambodia have created a somewhat deep affection for the people of that country. And I base this in part on your very moving story about Bofana, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and made into a movie as well as captured in your book. And also from what I took to be somewhat of a lament, a nostalgic lament about the culture being best symbolized by the Angkor temple. Is there a symbolism for you in those ruins?
Well, yes. Well, the ruins aside, remember, that's what I studied at university. That Cambodia is, I studied it from afar, because it's the country most influenced in many respects by India. So I had already had a basis for understanding and appreciating. And then you live there, and if you didn't care a lot about them, you wouldn't spend all the time working there. I mean, you can only care about so many countries, I think. And there's no question. I very much love the country, the culture, the people. I can't stand what's happened to it. Yes. I mean, if you care about it, then you're going to be more angry than if you didn't. And Angkor, you can't, if you know Cambodia, you can't help but understand that it plays a significant role, first of all, as a symbol of what it used to be. And I'm not that nostalgic about it. I love the temples. They're gorgeous, and it's a monument to the ingenious and artistic and engineering might of Cambodia. But it's also for Cambodians in particular, it is their reminder that this is their old culture. They're not some ne'er-do-well little developing nation, which is one of those almost patronizing things to say about all these countries with their very old civilizations. And they were developed long before we were. I also wrote an investigation of tourism, where earning money through tourism, particularly to Angkor, is hurting the temples themselves.
My wife and I were there in 2014 to see those temples. So we
what did you think?
Didn't really get much feeling for a context, I'd have to say, in terms of how the Cambodian people felt about it then, but certainly in awe of what they stood for and the beauty of that you could see of those temples.
Were they very crowded?
Actually, not too.
Oh,
Not
good.
too
You were
in
lucky.
2014.
You're
Yes.
lucky. Good, good, good.
You had kind of a rare opportunity to get close-up views of what was happening in Cambodia, even to the extent of being able to, with your group, personally interview Pol Pot. Can you describe that experience for us?
Well, as I said, Cambodia was cut off as soon as the Khmer Rouge won. Cut off. Only 2 or 3 countries had flights into it. No outside world mail, no outside world telephone, no outside world cable. If you wanted the only way to contact anybody there is through the government, and that's no contact. So the only thing we could know about Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge won and closed off the country was through refugees who got to the border in Thailand, or through official broadcasts. There used to be something called the FIBIS, Foreign Broadcast Information Service, where you could read every day what was on the foreign broadcasts of any country. And so we were always reading those from FIBIS to try to keep up. And then reporters would interview the rare official who got to go in and out. So we were all worried about what was going on. And I was one of the journalists who kept sending requests for visa. Can I come and see what's going on? And towards the end of 1978, the Khmer Rouge realized that the Vietnamese were not going to put up with their border war anymore. The Khmer Rouge were really worried. They realized that they had pushed too hard, and they were afraid that Vietnam was going to invade and possibly go as far as the Mekong. So first they asked the UN generals, the Secretary General of the UN, then Kurt Waldheim. They asked him to come, and they hoped that would keep the Vietnamese from invading. But Kurt Waldheim said, no, thank you. And so they asked 2 journalists and a professor, and I was one of the 2 journalists. So we were the first, and it turned out the last non-communist press, I should say. And it was amazing. It was like the only thing that helped me in my preparations was to read up on the Danish Red Cross group that had been allowed to go to the Theresienstadt camp, and they got fooled with orchestras and flowers and all that sort of stuff. And that was the only preparation I could do, and that really helped because we were everything we did was under their control. If we talked to anybody, that person was brought to us. And so it was very spooky. And I was the only one of the group that had lived there. And I realized how spooky it was, because I realized how, the cities had been emptied. There were no schools. The temples, Buddhist temples, weren't being used. And I knew the shop, there's nothing. So I was really spooked. And then on the very last day, we were given an hour before we were taken to interview Pol Pot. And my journalist colleague, Richard Dudman, and I were taken in one group. And then after that, the professor went. So as was required in those days, we both had written out questions on duplicates and given it in advance with no idea whether or not we talked to him. We arrived. He was flanked by his foreign minister and the number 2 in the foreign ministry and the top translator. And we sat down. He looked very debonair. He was in a really very nicely tailored Mao suit, charming looking. And we sat down, and even though we knew he spoke French, he would only speak Khmer. And through the translations, he said, "We will give you answers to your questions later, but now he was going to talk to us about the real problem. And so it was almost 2 hours of listening to how Vietnam was going to invade Cambodia and the United States and NATO should come and protect Cambodia, because he feared that Vietnam would be supported by the Soviet Union and, the Warsaw Pact, if you remember what that was.
Oh, yeah.
So that he imagined the Warsaw Pact coming with Vietnam, and he needed NATO to support him. That's all he talked about. That was and that's clearly then it became quite clear why we had been brought there, to bring back that message. So that was our last night, and we went back to our guest house, the official guest house, and we went to bed. And that night, a Cambodian gunman came, attacked our house. I fled to my room. The gunman went upstairs, shot at the bottom part of Mr. Dudman's room, and then went into the bedroom of the academic and murdered him.
Malcolm
the next
Caldwell.
day, Malcolm Caldwell. The next day, we took the flight to Beijing with his body in a casket. And 2 days later, the Vietnamese invaded. So it was astonishing.
Did you ever have the feeling that maybe this had some similarity to what it might have been like to interview Adolf Hitler?
No. What I kept thinking is, now I have a taste for what Cambodians have gone through the last 4 years.
Yeah.
That the fear of that night, they went through every night. If they heard a dog barking in their villages, they knew somebody was going to be taken away and killed for no good reason. So I didn't think of anything but, my God, how could you live through this?
Yeah, that must have been pretty traumatic.
Yeah.
You wrote an op-ed in 2015 about being asked to testify at the War Crimes Tribunal for Pol Pot. Mm-hmm. Tell us what was at stake in your decision and how that turned out.
Well, this is a lively subject among journalists because 2 reasons. There's the philosophical that if you testify, are you taking sides? And then there's the question of the rules for journalism, that you can't betray a source. So if you were called to testify and you had promised the source anonymity, then you couldn't testify about it. So there are all kinds of legal things, and it's only been in the last few decades that reporters have been called to testify. I looked at it as, if I didn't testify, I'd be taking a privileged position that I think is unwarranted, that we are, in fact, individuals. There's nothing in the journalist code that doesn't allow you to do it. And if I didn't do it, I felt that I would be taking too much of a privileged position because I was witnessing stuff nobody else witnessed. Then secondly, I checked with a lawyer, and he said, before you testify, put any material you're going to refer to in the public record. So that's what I did. I put all of my papers and photographs and tapes of interviews. I gave it all to my university, so it was on the public record. And then I went and testified.
The theme of this podcast is service, and I invited you to talk with me out of my personal conviction. Hopefully it's shared by the American people, that journalists, particularly war correspondents, perform a vital service for our democracy, even if that's sometimes controversial. Do you as a journalist share that view? Is it a significant driver of your motivation?
Well, yes, it's up to you. You make it sound more ennobling than it feels. We journalists have to be there, because how can you expect? We're not fighting. War is a very important decision for any country to take, and how it's executed. The ramifications are you can't even begin to talk about it. So yeah, we have to be there. And yes, it's important for democracy. And you know a country is becoming anti-democratic when they start putting the journalists in jails. And no one stands up for us in the middle of a baseball game and say, thank you for your service. No one ever thanks us for a service. And we're bound to be thrown in jail before we're given a thank you for your democracy award. It's a service that's not often recognized. And the previous president was trying to get rid of us. And it was, and I think that was a clue to the threat to democracy. If you do not allow journalism, and you don't have to agree with us, and you can check us out, but without journalism, it's, what did Thomas Jefferson say? If it's a question of government or newspapers, I'll take newspapers.
And the Washington Post has adopted the motto, democracy dies in darkness.
Yes.
The same type of thing.
And, who are the heroes that we see in other countries, like in Russia?
Yeah.
They're journalists, and it's always journalists. And it's scary. And you're putting your life on the line in a way that is not recognized as such. There are no medals.
Thinking back to Vietnam and Kate, Katrine, and Frankie, were they motivated by any kind of sense of calling to tell story, or is it an adventure for them?
Oh, if it were just an adventure, no, they would not have put up with this, because no, of course, they were serious people. They were serious people, and this was the most important thing that was going on in the world. So yeah, absolutely. And the diligence and hard work they put in, and the sacrifices they made, that's not adventure. That's a deep commitment. And Katrine work was recognized pretty much right away. She's the first woman to ever win the George Boak Award for photography, which is generally for difficult conflict. And then the first woman to ever win the Robert Capa Gold Medal Award. That's huge. Very young woman.
Has any woman ever made a combat jump like she did with the 173rd Brigade? And
I don't know. That was the only one during the Vietnam War. I don't know. I did not do that research. Then, I mean, you do that. You can read my book and say, oh, what adventure, but you don't feel, I mean, I was trying to make you feel all of the work and what they had to put up with. And they, particularly Katrine and Kate Webb, the Australian, the combat reporter, they suffered serious PTSD. I mean, when you read the book, you realize that they witnessed more war than most soldiers did, easily. And in those days, not only was PTSD not recognized as such, but it certainly was not considered that journalists suffered from it. That is the soldiers who suffer from that, and whatever it was called in those days. So yeah, it's a calling, very much so, and especially when the war rewards were not obvious and the deficits were very clear. I mean, you took a lot of hassle.
Okay, let's shift gears again. I'd be remiss in not asking you about your work with the New York Times, and in particular with the team covering 9/11, which led to you and the team being awarded the Pulitzer Prize. What was it about that work that led to this distinct recognition?
Well, this is it's a good portion of the paper, and it's because the Times was, in New York. Well, I had been the Pentagon correspondent, and I'd just been asked to go into international economics beat, but they put me right back on the beat. We just threw everything at it. We did, the people we lost profiles. We did. I was part of the reaction and what they were going to do, and the military side. And it's, some of us who covered wars before, we saw the towers, we saw what happened to the Pentagon, and we said, this is what we covered outside of the country. Now it's here, and trying to get that message across. That's the first attack since Pearl Harbor. It was just historic, and but it was also it was exhausting because again, as a reporter, the administration of President George W. Bush didn't want us to get too close. So you're worried about your country, but then you got all the static of the administration. It's all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, the decision to go into Iraq just tore up. This is after 9/11, but
Sure.
But 9/11 that was one of the most intense years for the newspaper, I think, for the country.
Well, there's so much more that we could explore with your writings and everything, but I'm respectful of your time, and I do want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And maybe I'm going to be the first, but let me say thank you for your service, Elizabeth Becker.
Well, I will accept that as a journalist, and no, thank you for thinking of us as providing that service. That's very touching. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome, and you've earned so much more than that.
No. So, thank you so much.
Again, this is Alan Salisbury with Profiles in Service. We've talked with Elizabeth Becker today, and I look forward to our next opportunity to join the listening audience with our next Profile in Service. Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is powered by and copyright of the Coda Support Foundation. Coda Support presents Profiles in Service is hosted by Major General Alan B. Salisbury and produced by Carly Van Tassel. The opinions of the guests on the show do not directly reflect the stance of the Coda Support Foundation. To learn more about Coda Support, please visit www.codasupport.org or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Finally, if you or someone you know is a service member, veteran, caregiver, or military family member in need of assistance, please visit codasupport.org/get-help or create a free account at patriotlink.org.